Hi, my name is McKenna. In my research, I'm interested in persuasion. So persuasion is important in interpersonal contexts, right? So sometimes you want to change someone's mind, get them to think what you think about some important matter. It's also important in more social and political contexts. So think here of public health campaigns or the sort of political campaigning that's actually trying to change hearts and minds. So in my research, I'm interested in a range of conceptual, psychological, epistemological, and ethical questions about persuasion. So what I'll do here is just briefly talk through these various questions. So first, the conceptual questions. So here are the concerns with what persuasion is and what distinguishes it from other forms of influence, such as indoctrination. Perhaps surprisingly, you get more, or at least I got more clarification about this from looking at the psychological literature than the philosophical literature. In psychology, persuasion is typically viewed as the attempt to change someone's mental attitudes via some sort of communication, a persuasive message, in a way that permits the target of the message a certain degree of freedom. And that's what's meant to distinguish persuasion from, for example, indoctrination. With persuasion, you aren't trying to force someone to change their mind. Rather, you're giving them something, a reason, an argument that's meant to get them to change their mind. What do we know about which persuasive strategies are successful and in which contexts? So here we want to turn to the psychology of persuasion. The kind of general moral of the psychology of persuasion is that you aren't going to find one-size-fits-all persuasive strategies. Rather, successful persuasive strategies are strategies that are tailored to fit particular audiences or particular contexts. So for example, if you want to change public attitudes towards some complicated tax policy, chances are many people are not particularly interested in the details of the policy, so best not to get into the details in the weeds. Rather, you want to prompt them to use simple decision rules or heuristics, such as listen to the experts. Of course, if your audience doesn't like the recognized experts, you want to prompt them to listen to those they do actually listen to, who they see as the experts. I'm particularly interested in persuasion in the context of science communication. In literature here, there's a sort of divide between two different camps. One camp thinks that, in general, the best strategy for a scientist or a science communicator is to simply give the public relevant scientific information. Of course, they might not understand everything, so you want to kind of tailor the information that you give to the level of understanding, but you kind of simply provide the information. So call these simple information strategies. Another camp thinks that, at least in contexts where things have become very politicized, polarized, think here of climate change, these simple information strategies aren't going to work. You have to do something else, perhaps appeal to the values of your audience or find a spokesperson who can speak to that audience. And that might not be a scientist, that might be, for example, a religious figure. So, of course, this debate between these two camps is in large part an empirical debate. The question is, which of these strategies on the whole is most effective, or which of these strategies is effective in which contexts? I mean, just to kind of say something about that empirical debate, as I understand it, the kind of current situation is that people that want to defend these simple information strategies think that people have been far too quick to conclude that they aren't going to work, even in contexts where issues have become politicized. So some people now think that actually, even in those contexts, simply providing information can actually be quite effective if it is done in a sensible way. But let's move away from these empirical issues and talk a little bit about some epistemological and ethical issues, starting with the epistemological. You might think that simple information strategies are better than these other strategies that appeal to values from the epistemological point of view. Why? Well, the thought would be that if you're giving people information, evidence, then if they change their minds, it'll be on the basis of that evidence, so that change of attitude will be entirely rational. On the other hand, if you do it by appealing to values or something like that, that might look like a less than rational, perhaps even irrational process. So there's lots to be said here, but I think that simple line of thought is far too quick. To see why, just think a little about how exactly science denial works. So take a climate change skeptic. If you can find a way of presenting that evidence, or find someone who can present that evidence in a way that is persuasive to the skeptic, that gets them to change their mind, then it's hard to see why that change of mind wouldn't be rational. After all, it is based on the evidence. It's now they can finally recognise the force of that evidence. So that's the epistemological side of things. Moving to the ethical side of things, in general, persuasion raises lots of interesting ethical questions. So think again about interpersonal contexts. So here you might be concerned with what you might call the coercive power of argument. So imagine this scenario. You've got a patient who has got a chronic medical condition, and they're speaking to their doctor, who is very strongly advocating that they start to use a new assistive technology to deal with the condition. So the doctor is giving the patient all these reasons why it's a good idea, and the patient thinks, well, this doctor knows what they're talking about, they're an expert, perhaps I should do that. It's not hard to imagine versions of this scenario where this is a kind of illegitimate interference with the patient's ability to make up their own minds. It could be that for this patient, actually, the technology isn't going to be particularly useful, and the patient could recognise that because they can draw on their own experiences with the condition, but the doctor's presentation is so compelling that the patient kind of feels almost forced to go along with it. But of course, the doctor is giving arguments, reasons. It's persuasion in the kind of mode where you provide a set of arguments that are designed to convince the intended audience, the patient. What though about these kind of social and political contexts that I've also been talking about? So in general, there's a kind of school of thought in science communication which says that what you want to do is communicate the end result of the scientific process. So of course, in science, it's very messy, there are lots of compromises and fudges along the way. The process by which a scientific consensus is established is often quite complicated, and there can be all sorts of reasons why the consensus is this rather than that. But the idea would be, according to the school of thought, you don't report any of that, you just report the consensus. Now, of course, in certain contexts, that might be entirely legitimate, it might be very successful, but it can run into certain problems. So think here again about science denial. Science denial is often driven by kind of paranoia and a tendency towards conspiracy theorizing. And of course, if you've got science communicators that are just giving the nice end product and not getting into all the messy details, that can feed into certain suspicions that science denialists tend to have. So of course, the argument here is not that you should always go into all the messy, complicated stuff. The point though is that if you ignore that, what you do is you perpetuate a kind of naive, simplistic understanding of science. And given that it's a naive and simplistic understanding, that can itself become a fuel to science denial and various forms of skepticism. So probably I've managed to raise more questions than answer those questions in the context of this, but I'm a philosopher, sorry. But hopefully in the years to come, I'll manage to answer some of them. So thanks for listening.